Hello, and welcome to the Author's Attic. My name is Matthew Martinez, and I am here with Dr. George Wilson. Today we will be discussing a recent collaborative project entitled Racial Income Inequality and Public Sector Privatization, slated to come out in the May issue of Social Problems. Dr. Wilson is a full professor of sociology at the University of Miami. Dr. Wilson, you had the opportunity to work with Dr. Vincent Rochinho and Dr. Matt Huffman on this project. What inspired you all to take on this endeavor?
Well, thank you, Matthew. It's good to be here. We noticed that in the sociological literature, over a course of quite a few decades, the public sector was characterized as what's called the ethnic occupational niche for African Americans, meaning it's the sector of the labor market where African Americans achieve relative parity with whites in socioeconomic outcomes. However, we also noticed that there were no recent studies of the public sector. Most of the studies had been done 3 or 4 or decades ago or somewhere along those lines, and we also noticed that there were very important and fundamental changes in the social organization of work in the public sector. Various forms of privatization are starting to, or have started to, permeate the public sector workplace. So we decided to examine whether these changes in the public sector workplace are having an impact on the public sector as the ongoing and long-standing and continuing ethnic occupational niche for African Americans.
Okay, very good. And in this article, you discuss a central concept of new governance. What do you mean by this concept of new governance?
New governance, Matthew, is a form of privatization that's rooted in the logic of neoliberal reform. New governance is the notion that the public sector should become much more privatized in terms of incentivizing workers to achieve results and becoming much more similar to the way the private labor market had always worked in the United States. Now, the private labor market, of course, is a sector of the economy where African Americans did not do relatively well with whites. So we thought that the public sector, as it kind of morphed into the private sector in terms of work conditions, this new governance reform, it would have an impact on socioeconomic outcomes. But in terms of what constitutes new governance, we're talking about some very specific things, namely, number one, the changing work status of individuals. They become much more vulnerable to managerial discretion in socioeconomic outcomes. Their status becomes what's called declassified, which means, most importantly, that they become employees at will, which means, for example, they can be terminated without any given reason at all. In addition, new governance also encompasses the loss of traditional kinds of worker rights to contest workplace-based outcomes. So the combination of the changing work status and the changing work conditions of public sector workers might be a basis for the losing of, or the slow eradication or systematic eradication of this ethnic occupational niche.
Okay, and why do you think then studying new governance is an important avenue of research as it relates to minorities and African American workers?
Well, studying new governance is very important because it's just one example and one manifestation of increasing neoliberal reform in the public sector. We've seen the public sector become increasingly privatized in the recent decade in domain, for example, in the military and the educational system. And now we're seeing it permeate the work conditions of the public sector. And the fact that the specific change in work conditions and the changing status of employees in the public sector is coming more and more to resemble the private sector, the locational labor market where African Americans have not fared very well. We thought that maybe this would have an adverse impact on African Americans as a racial minority group in socioeconomic attainment.
Okay, and what were the main results of your study?
The results were by and large consistent with what our predictions were. There was a systematic, over the course of approximately 25-year period that we examined, where the relative parity that African Americans had achieved in this study in income attainment was slowly being eradicated. In other words, there was a progressive and systematic broadening of the income gap between whites and African Americans in public sector employment. And so that bore out our hypotheses that, yes, the changing work conditions in the public sector and the changing status of workers was having an adverse impact in the racial context, specifically African Americans relative to whites.
Okay. And what are the policy implications for results like these?
Oh, the policy implications are tremendous, and I'm very unhappy to say negative. African Americans are losing the location in the American labor market where they have historically done well, historically at least in the post-1965 civil rights era. The rise of a black middle class in the last 4 or 5 decades has been achieved by and large in public sector employment. If African Americans lose that niche, the very source of an ongoing and continuing middle class is being threatened. That means that the African American middle class is absolutely in jeopardy. And significantly, that has intergenerational implications. If generation one, that is the African American middle class, begins to lose their standing or systematically loses their standing, that means, for example, they cannot accumulate the resources to help to ensure the successful socioeconomic outcome of their children and grandchildren in the next decades. So we're looking at something that can have very, very fundamental intergenerational implications for African Americans.
Okay. And how would you recommend for policymakers to move forward?
We recommend that policymakers try to strike a balance between the thrust of new governance reform and the need to maintain patterns of equity in public service employment. The new governance movement, as some call it, has become very, very popular and is, in fact, bipartisan in terms of political support. I mean, Democrats are as into it as Republicans are. There seems to be no way to turn the tide. Well, the tide is not going to be turned. Certain concessions have to be made in terms of trying to ensure equity, so that socioeconomic outcomes need to be monitored very, very closely.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to share with your audience regarding this particular research?
We are writing a number of papers on this topic across various socioeconomic outcomes, mobility, upward and downward across the occupational structure, earnings, and also the attainment of what we call structurally important aspects of jobs, namely the attainment of job authority, and the findings emerge as consistent across these various socioeconomic outcomes. We are looking at a situation in which the very survival of the African American middle class is in jeopardy. If concessions of the type that I mentioned are not made, if new governance is not curbed in terms of its overarching thrust, then we're looking at an increase in the dynamics of racial inequality in the United States over the course of at least in the next few decades.
Okay. Well, we definitely look forward to this research coming out, and especially the article coming out in Social Problems. We would like to thank you for your time here today on the Author's Attic. And for the audience out there, just remember, check us out in previous episodes on Social Problems YouTube channel. Also be sure to follow us on Twitter at SocProbsJournal and on Facebook to be informed of future releases of the Author's Attic. Thank you again, and we will see you next time.